Cast, where this time we'll be talking about fractures to the bone and then how those fractures are repaired. So I think we'll split this into two, just a real quick one here at first to describe and explain the different types of bone fractures, and then we'll do a second one here where we talk about the fracture and the repair and the healing of those fractures. So bones are susceptible to fractures, as some of you are all too familiar with. You've broken a bone maybe before, or fractured it or cracked it in some way. And the fractures are named based on the description of how the bone was fractured. So this table here shows you the name of the fracture type, a little picture of what's going on, a description of what's happening, and then any sort of comments here. So one type of fracture is a comminuted fracture, where you can see the bone is completely broken into lots of small little fragments or pieces there. A compression fracture is the bone is crushed, and some compression fractures can lead to this comminuted part here, but typically you see a compression fracture described in sort of a flat bone area there. A depressed fracture, the broken bone portion is pressed inward, so it's not really crushed, more of this crack that's then sort of pushed in that way, and again you'll see that happening here most likely in flat bones. Impacted fractures occur here where the diaphysis and the epiphysis come together, so that epiphyseal line maybe is weaker and the diaphysis of the bone is driven into the epiphysis of the bone in that direction. So the bone ends are forced into one another there. A spiral fracture is just what it sounds like. You had some sort of twisting motion, and generally you see this in the diaphysis of the bone there. And then according to this table here, the last one here is the green stick. And a green stick, it refers to this incomplete bone break here, so only the periosteum and some of that compact bone on this side has broken, and not so much on this side, not broken all the way through. And the reference here is like if you break a young twig, or try to break a twig on a tree that's young, it's green and it doesn't break all the way. Like you may be able to snap it, but then you still have some of that bark sort of remaining, and you kind of see that right there. Okay. So the comments here are worthwhile sort of looking through. Let's take just a couple of other looks at some things. And so here we have a complete fracture. This is from just another text here going all the way through. So this might be complete and sort of maybe spiral. Incomplete would be the green stick there. Fracture. Here's a comminuted fracture here. Again, the bone crushed into many pieces. This transverse fracture here is similar to this complete fracture. Maybe it didn't go all the way through, just sort of spiraled around, or sorry, sort of collared the bone there. Here we see an impacted fracture, where again the bone ends are driven into one another, typically probably by a force in this direction. And we see the spiral fracture as a result of some twisting motion there. And oblique is like a complete fracture there. It's just that it is at an angle as compared to this transverse, which just goes across the long axis of the bone all the way there. Okay. So pretty short and quick one there. Different. Hopefully you're able to describe and explain the different types of bone fractures there. But in the following slides here, there are 9 images, X-ray images to identify. You can practice identifying here and describing the X-ray images of the fractures, and then see how those fractures were reduced and fixed. Those procedures there. So let me just go back a slide and talk about this reduction and fixation. So if you had sort of this, let's go with the spiral example here. The reduction would mean to line the bones back up with one another. So reducing the fracture, or a reduction, would mean to line the bones back up, line up the bone ends with one another. And so with this spiral fracture, relatively easy to do. You'd have to just move these bone ends back together here a little bit so that they are going to then line up. maybe a little bit more difficult to do here, the comminuted fracture, because you have to get all these little bone fragments lined up with one another there. Right? And then the fixation is sort of just what it's called there. Sometimes it's also called traction. Right? So they will oftentimes, once they reduce the fracture there, they will put little screws in here, and then affix a metal plate to that to hold the bone in place if it's a severe fracture like that. Other times they will simply do what you see most often, and that is put once they reduce that fracture, put an external cast around the outside of the bone to hold that in place again. So the fixation can either be external, as in a cast, so external, or internal, as in using plates and screws to hold those in place there. So do run this slideshow from Blackboard and see if you can identify those 9 different fractures, and then look and see how they've been reduced and then fixed into those extra images. Okay, thanks for listening, and bring your questions to class. We'll deal in another screencast with B here, the steps in fracture repair and the healing.